and welcome to today's webinar, Revitalising the High Street, how location and spend data supports economic development. My name is Mark Freeman, and I'll be guiding you through today's session, which is all about how data-driven insights can transform decision-making across the local government sector. As we face increasing challenges like the rising cost of living, tightening consumer spending, and business uncertainty around investment, understanding where and how people are interacting with place and space is becoming increasingly influential for initiatives designed to support local businesses as well as help communities flourish. Today, we're all going to be exploring how combining footfall and spend data can provide a holistic view of local economic activity, helping the audience identify, monitor, and validate those initiatives that drive growth and community engagement. We've got a great lineup of speakers for you today. They'll be sharing their expertise and a few real-world examples in there, with a great one at the end from Joel. But first, a brief introduction from me on who those speakers are. We have Gary Beaumont. He's Transport and Data Manager at Hertfordshire County Council. We have Joel Doherty. He's Vice President of Product Management at Mastercard. And finally, Conrad Paulson, CEO of Huq. I'll now pass over to Gary, who will do a fuller intro, followed by Joel and Conrad.
Hi, good morning, everybody. So I'm Gary Beaumont. I'm the Transport Planning and Data Manager at Hertfordshire County Council, and I sit within the Growth and Infrastructure unit here. So I've got about 16 years of experience at Hertfordshire, where I've been instrumental in establishing a foundation for data-driven and evidence-led decision-making. My work is focused on embedding a culture of monitoring and evaluation, which allows us to measure success and, just as importantly, data to learn valuable lessons about what works and what doesn't.
Next is Joel, please.
I apologize. Sorry about that, everyone. Joel Doherty with MasterCard. As Mark has indicated, I lead the product management side of the business around all of our transaction data. So think of MasterCard not as much as a credit card company for the sake of today's conversation, but also a data company, where we look at all of the types of insights and analytics that we can glean from consumer credit card transactions and the stories that we can uncover. And so my team globally builds out different solutions, different products, different insights, certainly for the public sector, as well as other sectors, including financial institutions, merchants, and other industries alike. Conrad? I think Conrad may still have on mute.
Oh, go for it.
Sorry. Good morning. I'll try that again. Good morning, everybody. So, Conrad Paulson, CEO of Huq. Huq measures footfall by harnessing location data from mobile phones to provide detailed understanding of how populations use the built environment. Currently, we provide insight data to over 90 local authorities and bids in the UK. And our data helps these organisations to unlock funding and accurately measure the impact of their initiatives and policies. So as a company, we're fanatical about sourcing the very highest data quality, and we're going to explore today how and why we work with Mastercard in that regard. But in terms of our own data, that powers our products. As a result, our products enable customers to understand far more than just footfall, which we're going to get into in more detail throughout the course of the webinar.
Great stuff. So, a full agenda today. We'll be moving through, but I just want to highlight this will be a recorded session. So naturally, we'll be sharing that to the attendees today. There'll be a Q&A session at the end. So please do submit any questions that you have as we go along. We'll try and coordinate a good list of questions at the end and tackle those by theme. This is your chance to ask the experts in the room on how they could potentially kind of give you insights into a particular initiative or project that you're thinking of, or general kind of themes and problems. So do pose those questions where you can. Right, so we are going to move into the start of the conversation now. The kind of way to probably kick this off is to just explore and expand on what we mean by spend and footfall data, and as well as kind of draw upon the value that they bring when combined, as well as the overview that they bring, obviously, to the audience that we have today, thinking local government and bids. Where's that value in this data in your world? So as we covered in the intro to this webinar, now more than ever, it's crucial to really understand where footfall is, higher, lower, where people are spending, and how this is changing over time. It can be indicators of health, vitality. It can be indicators of project impact, or the need for investment or change. These insights, they're becoming increasingly vital for everybody on this call today. With the mission of driving community engagement, supporting local economy and attracting visitors into their areas, these data points are increasingly essential as a kind of are effectively truth data points that you can leverage to support your initiatives. I'm going to pose a question to Joel. Given this context, given that introduction, can you tell us more about transaction data? Give us a bit of an introduction to it, and why understanding consumer spending behaviour is becoming more important for local governments and bids.
Sure. Thank you for the question, Mark. The value and importance of transaction data is often underlooked and underscored. It is an incredibly rich data set that helps us understand exactly how consumers do spend, but more importantly, how they go about those spending decisions. And so when we think of the transaction data that's derived from all of our MasterCard credit card transactions, it helps us truly understand not just how much a consumer might spend, but where did they spend? How far did they come to make that purchase? Were they close to home, or was it more of a transient purchase they did on their travels? What types of merchants do they seem to have affinities for? Where do they spend more of their discretionary spend than not? And so it can paint a complete customer journey and tell us an incredible amount of information about not just where people spend, not just how much they spend, but all of the other context around those decisions that help shed a lot of light on the types of questions and hypotheses that we know that the councils and the public sector stakeholders are looking for.
That's great, thank you. Moving into to Conrad, why is combining footfall and spend data such a valuable tool, and why did you bring MasterCard into the Huq partner network?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, as following on from Joel's point, a single data set often only tells part of the story. So rich though we know our mobility data is, and all of the insights that we can offer about how many people are visiting an environment and where they come from and how long they stay, that's really just one lens. And to really understand how a space is being used, what the real potential for that space is, you really need to combine it with other data sets. And as I said at the start of the session, data quality is absolutely essential. We're acutely aware that there are policies and initiatives being based on the products and services that we offer to our customers in the public sector, and those have societal and economic impact. So it's incredibly important that you can rely on the underlying data that's providing those insights. So clearly, MasterCard is a fantastic partner for that. They have the quality of the data and the breadth of the data that we know is so essential to provide that. So that consistency is what was critical when we decided to work together.
Yeah, I think I'd just add to that real quick, Mark, if I can. That combination of footfall and purchase data, it does help tell the whole story. And you can imagine that if you just had one view versus the other, that you might understand that people are visiting different locations, but they're not making those spend decisions, or conversely, they're making spend decisions, but you don't know what other types of of journeys and visits that they're making. And if you don't combine those two things, you could put yourself on a path to making some very misguided decisions and really relying on guesswork, as opposed to the the veracity and strength of that data set.
Exactly that. I think it's a great time to bring in Gary, actually, just to add something from your perspective about what this data offers and why should a local government be leveraging spend and footfall data when it comes to some of those key decisions that they're looking to make.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So data is absolutely crucial because it drives evidence-led based decisions, which leads to the best possible outcomes. It allows us to document and learn from our actions, helping to minimise mistakes in the public sector, particularly where transparency and accountability are paramount. Data enables us to justify our decisions to the public that ultimately we serve. So I think it's really key that we obviously get that right.
Great, thanks, Gary. So I think hopefully that's kind of demystified a little bit what footfall data is, the key bits that really stand out as being impactful, and how that can start to help you in your sector and work towards a solution with you and your initiatives. What we'll quickly do though is we'll move into start to think about the applications of it and where the value is. So this section will cover how this data can be used to help secure funding, to justify investment and initiatives. Local councils and bids often require clear, actionable insights that support those applications, a good insight into the why, the problem, the issue. It has to demonstrate the potential tangible impact of any public spending on local economies and urban development. If the objective or the task at hand is about driving visitation and driving change in spend, then it kind of naturally follows that the data that showcases this is clearly vital. And that does feel to be a core component of much of the development initiatives that are happening out there. However, I think what a lot of our attendees will feel today is understanding how residents and visitors interact with public spaces and retail centres. It's a challenge. It's got a cost to it. It's problematic. Accuracy, timing, all of those things combined, as well as constrained budgets. Right? It's a tough data point to acquire, but a really impactful one if we can. I think what we want to do today is just give you that intro into how it can be used, and that footfall and consumer spend data, when you can access it and you can apply it, it will give the most accurate picture of the now in your communities and showcases real world behaviour. And it's those near real-time insights that give you the targeted validation that you'll need for your change-led initiatives. So I'll just move into the panel now to help broaden this out. So the first question will head to Joel. Many of our clients say it's great to have spend data and see where consumers are actively spending and increasingly not spending. That can be the challenge for sure. But how can councils and bids get the most out of spend data, to ensure that it drives impactful and measurable outcomes?
Look, I think it always comes down to the quality and simplicity of the use cases that you've defined. I'll give you a couple of real world examples. One is around Wembley Stadium in the United Kingdom, where the hypothesis was that the traffic going to some of the events at Wembley were not putting as much of a burden on the public transit system as was expected. And so we used MasterCard data to actually look at all of the activity that event goers who are off to Wembley to watch the football game were partaking in. Were they coming in the night before and staying in a hotel? Were they spending in restaurants before the match, or were they spending in the pubs after the match? Were they in fact coming in public transit, or were they perhaps traveling and taking private parking? And when we looked at all of those elements of the way people were moving, the way people were spending, it did highlight a few gaps on the public transport infrastructure, where where larger pockets of consumers were coming from for that particular event, and provided for some additional investment and planning longer term to support that. on an economic development front, a similar situation has arisen where MasterCard and footfall data plays a role. This happens to be not specific to the UK, but through the World Economic Forum, we're looking at a project today we're working on where a football club has actually picked up and left town and they've gone. And so they've left a real hole basically in the city center. So the study is to very quickly leverage the data to identify what other merchant opportunities should we bring to that core that will bring back that same segment of customers, help stimulate similar amounts of spend, and effectively create a bit of a new economy where the footballer economy has picked up and left. And so the data is telling us very clearly who those consumers are, what they're looking to spend on, the times of days, the days of week, and putting all that together is helping create a revitalization plan for that downtown core.
That's some great examples in there. Thank you, Joel. And I think, it certainly touched on some of those bigger projects and experience that MasterCard have already kind of dealt with and partnered with across the world. And there'll be some more examples as we go through this webinar. Just building on that, so just moving across to Conrad. You mentioned earlier developing strategies and for validating funding. What are the kind of the practical steps that bid managers can take to integrate data into their funding proposals?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. Yeah, so I guess the opportunities and building on Joel's point is to actually look at use the data to look at a much longer term view. So I think often the challenges that we see are that people come to us and say, right, okay, I need this data to validate an idea that I've already formed, or an initiative that we've already undertaken, and that's completely valid, of course. But what tends to happen through the course of that exploration of the data is that the data itself reveals where the opportunities are. The data itself reveals, okay, these are the changes you could make. This is what could happen. So in terms of kind of that practical application of the data, I guess we advocate that you start much earlier in the process, because it plays a part in informing what you could or should do. And then secondly, it's also the long-term changes, the types of behaviors that we're talking about measuring. Sometimes there's an impact, right? Sometimes there's an immediate impact of putting on an event or those kinds of things, but often the customers that we're working with are trying to use those events to generate long-term change, right? So I'm making a new audience aware of my space. So I'm making them aware of the facilities in my town, all those things. Now, there might be a short-term sort of sugar hit of, okay, I've drew a few people in to do that, but really what you're trying to understand over the long term is, are those people now returning, now that they know what's here, or now that they're aware of what's possible? And so the data types that we're talking about today are absolutely ideal for kind of measuring that. So it's not just about the volume of the footfall. So when we talk about footfall data and mobility data, it's also revealing where those journeys originated from instance. So you can identify, okay, these are postcode sectors which are now using our town but weren't using it before we put these initiatives in place. I think it's in terms of using it to unlock funding, we've got some great examples. I think probably the one I'd pick on is a team in Manchester had been trying, I think, for about 6 years to get a facility built in one of their parks, and unsuccessfully for that period, and then applying data to build the business case as to, we have the evidence to show that there is the right audience, the type of audience that generates the demand for this type of facility, in fact, enabled them to unlock £1 million plus funding for that facility. So a very modest investment in data enabled them to unlock that funding.
Great, thanks for that, Conrad. I think what I really liked in that is the hint towards this type of data being something to think about at those embryonic stages. It's definitely a foundational component for a lot of these initiatives and projects that we're seeing, and especially talking to Gary in and around this, he kind of talks that way too. If we think about where we've come to so far in this webinar, we've talked about an introduction to footfall and spend data, and we've talked about how it can be that almost semi-truth point to unlock funding. We're now moving into another kind of benefit of having access to this data and using it to its fullest capacity. Is it almost becomes the common thread throughout an entire project, throughout an entire initiative, from beginning to end. It can continue to be used to monitor, track any impacts of any actions, non-action, as well as used to validate the success of those initiatives that are being implemented and put into place. And of course, that's spend and footfall data, which are typically the key metrics of any initiative that is happening. So, having this data, it's a total, it provides total visibility throughout your project and ensures that your initiative is backed by real world evidence. So just moving into that phase, another question, we'll start with Joel. You mentioned earlier, the importance of gaining a better understanding of local areas and communities. Can you elaborate a bit on the visibility piece and how it helps local governments and organizations evaluate and enhance their initiatives?
Yeah, I think I actually think that visibility word, if you will, in the context of data, provides for two related topics. One, the visibility of data, I think, should be a constant. You've pointed that out, as did Conrad. I think that's a critical point, because sometimes we don't know what's going to happen when it does happen. I know we've done some studies with some of the councils in the United Kingdom, just anticipating heat waves and understanding what impact the heat wave had on merchants and different parts of the community. But the ability to visualize or have visibility down to more granular segments of the council, or more granular geographies, if you will, does become more critical. It also becomes much more difficult. And so the ways in which we think about how to treat the data and how to provide the data at a very granular level are carefully designed, but they provide incredible power, where I can now start at the state or region level, understand some of the dynamics that are going on from a spend, a footfall, a growth opportunity perspective. But then I can drill down to the council. I can drill down to the high street and look at what's going on within a few blocks of the high street. And when you start to analyze what's possible at that level and truly understand it, of course, the impact on your decision making, your council planning, all of those things are dramatically impacted in a positive way. The only other comment I'd make around visibility is really tied to the concept of visualizing the data as well. So we all have far too much data to consume today. That is a fact. And the only ways in which we can, as human beings, properly interpret the data is if two things exist. Number one, some context around what it is I'm trying to extract from that data. That's why I lean on the comment around use cases being well defined. But the second is the opportunity to visualize that data so that I can interpret it effectively and typically in real time. That doesn't necessarily mean a whole bunch of charts and graphs and dashboards all the time. It can mean different ways in which that data can be visualized based on the best ways in which you can interpret that data. But the whole visibility question is one about granularity, but it's also one about how do you interpret the data at whatever level of granularity you may be at, and the visual cues become absolutely a must.
Mm-hmm. I think that was a great point around data complexity and data volume as well. Lots of departments are juggling lots of data sets, and the goal is to find that commonality and that buy-in and that belief, and something that is really linking into what is actually happening on the ground. And I think as soon as you kind of start to leverage that in the initiatives and strategies that you're undertaking and implementing, that traction just builds and builds. I'm going to move across to a question for Conrad now. We've talked about, we've kind of moved into talking about tracking performance. What are the key mobility metrics that local government and bid managers should really focus on?
Yeah, so I think the question, there's two parts to that. So there are the individual metrics that you can measure with mobility. So for us, amongst the core ones of those are footfall itself, so the actual volume of people visiting an area. We talk about catchment areas, so that's an analysis about where those journeys are originating from. So basically, what's the home location of those visitors? I think there was a question that came in the chat actually about tourism, and that I'd just like to point out at that point, the power and the value of this data is that you can look beyond your own geography, right? So you can also understand the portion of which that's coming from domestic or overseas. So if you're an area which is high in tourism, then there's a really fascinating lens about the behaviour of the tourist population that you can narrow down to. So as well as catchment, we're looking at dwell time, so how long are people spending in those spaces, frequency, so how frequently they're returning, and then the power and the beauty of mobility data is it enables you to link to these demographic and socioeconomic descriptions, right? So not only are you looking at the volume of visitors in an area, but are they the type of visitor and the type of user that you're seeking to attract to that area? So you can think about each of those metrics individually, and certainly they each have, tremendously powerful insight. But as Joel was talking about, the combination of spend and mobility data it provides you one lens, but indeed, the combination of multiple types of mobility metric also reveal some perhaps less than obvious insights. So I guess some of the questions we often get is, okay, well, I run this event and it looked really busy, right? There were loads of people in that space. Maybe, okay, so maybe that particular area was very high footfall, but did they stick around? Did they visit the rest of the town while they were there? Did they ever come back again? So I think we often caution against just looking at, and most users and customers of ours are seeing beyond this now, right? They're seeing that footfall is the starting point, and it's a useful metric to an indicator, if you like, to know where to start the conversation or start the analysis, but it certainly doesn't stop there. It goes way beyond that. And mobility data provides the power to do that.
And it's not just understanding how that spend behavior occurs within the council. It's also making sure you've got some visibility and even the opportunity to benchmark data to some extent as to how that spend is occurring, perhaps in other councils. So if you use that tourism example, I may be delighted that we're seeing, 30% of our tourism dollar coming from Canada, where I happen to sit, and that's a wonderful thing that the council's celebrating. But the council may also really need to know that the Canadian tourism dollar is actually being spent at a rate of 3x over in Manchester, and I'm still leaving some of that Canadian tourism money on the table. And it's an opportunity for me to rethink, how do we continue to build that tourist presence, that tourist stay, the frequency, the length, all those good things, because I think I'm doing great, but I'm actually leaving some money on the table as those tourism dollars go next door at a perhaps a greater rate.
Yeah, I'd just like to build on that point. I think that international angle to that, but there's also a very local lens that you can apply to that. Okay, so understanding not only your own area, but also looking at your peers, your your competitors, the region that you sit within. So I think this benchmarking opportunity that is offered here is tremendous, right? Because it's about the context. You might think things are going badly, or you might think things are going really well. It's very difficult to understand that in isolation. It may be relative to the past, they're good or bad, but what these data types are offering you the ability to do is to see how that performance really measures up in the context of what's going on in the broader picture. So perhaps you're doing better than you think, or perhaps you're not maximizing the opportunity that your neighbors are, and you can look to those neighboring areas to maybe find clues about the strategies or the policies that they've put in place, which are enabling them to make the most of that. So yeah, this benchmarking point is a really, really important one.
Yeah, we usually summarize it with a single question, which is the pursuit of, is it me or is it the market, right? And so as we see fluctuations up or down, how much of that is because of what's going on in my own council, in my own backyard, as opposed to some more macro activity that might be further out of my control. Critical to know that.
And I think just to come in as well, it's important that we look at control areas where we're not perhaps having an event or an intervention, to see, again, compare. That might be within a local authority in itself. You're comparing one area where you may not be implementing a measure against somewhere where you are. And so I think that's absolutely key. So benchmarking and assessing it against control areas. And you can use this data to do all of those things.
I think that's a really good build, just bringing in benchmarking at that point. And I think the other bit I'd draw out in this conversation, it started with catchments, I then think we kind of moved to international, but I think the key thing there is kind of connections, from the micro to the local to the regional to the national to the international. Having a kind of a bit of a data insight into all of those levels can prove really key, because while some things rise, some things fall, but if you're just looking at your particular zone, you may not have that full ecosystem available to you. And the bit I really relate to was match day around the Olympic Park. Obviously very busy with footfall coming in, but as a resident, that was not going to be a location I wanted to go towards at that particular time. So you can really see how understanding that wider catchment piece and historical trend can really start to pinpoint the true impacts and benefits of events, initiatives, and everything else that's out there. We'll keep moving forward. Gary, I think that this is a question for you here that I have. So we've talked about using footfall and spend data to validate initiatives. And I think you have a particularly great example referencing pedestrianisation and a road closure trial. It'd be great if you could just kind of give an overview of that now, please.
Yeah, sure. So in Hertfordshire, we have a historic market town. It's a traditional high street that faces the usual challenges that a lot of high streets face, with issues like congestion, pollution, and ultimately it's dominated by the car, which does affect active travel. So in Hertfordshire, we've got key policy objectives where we want to try and promote active travel for obvious reasons, such as healthiness and well-being and getting people out and about. But in addition to that, and as part of our kind of response to the COVID pandemic and social distancing, it was an opportunity to apply this scheme in this town in Hertfordshire that would also promote walking and cycling. So ultimately, we closed a key high street to traffic on weekends, and whilst this was mostly supported by residents, there's some concerns about the economic impact of the scheme, particularly by certain groups. So data on footfall, dwell time, and spend was absolutely crucial, but also, again, talking about sort of the importance of having lots of information. It was really beneficial to have data around journey time, traffic flows, and public opinions as well. So it kind of all sort of worked together to help us. And it was crucial in understanding the impact on the intervention and also facilitating transparent discussions with those key stakeholders, including residents. Although external factors like the economy and weather and various other things can influence results, and I think that's an important point, we were able to show that the high street and businesses were not adversely impacted by this directly by this particular scheme. So that was a real key lesson that we learned from this exercise through the data and how we applied and understood that. So the evidence, especially when combining multiple data sets, helped reassure stakeholders that the scheme's impact wasn't as negative as initially feared. So that was also very good. And so we could actually apply that back to the residents and those stakeholders. And it's also reassuring to see that this analysis that we did, this exercise, sort of corresponds with other pieces of evidence out there that support our findings. That pedestrian does not generally tend to, that pedestrianisation does generally tend to improve spend in the local economy. That's not to say that that's always going to be the case in every situation, but this data can help us understand and unpick that.
I think that's been great to kind of understand how you've seen success using this data. I think now is probably a good time to probably draw on this a little bit more. You know, elevating above that. Just if you wouldn't mind breaking down, I suppose, how you've unlocked or began to work with this data, and what are the most common challenges, I suppose, you've faced when planning community events, and how can this data kind of help overcome these? I think in stakeholders as well, kind of getting them on board.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. So one of the biggest challenges for me, I suppose, and it may be similar to those in Hertfordshire, are understanding public opinion and perception, which can be insightful and it's really useful to tap into that knowledge, but it can also have certain biases and influences. So data helps by providing an objective view, especially when multiple data sets align and start to tell that story. So it's important for analysts to remain impartial, because we too can have inherent biases, particularly from local authorities where we're trying to achieve an objective, but we also need to be objective ourselves. So additionally, data shouldn't be used against parties, but it should be used to gain buy-in and help others. For example, businesses can use trend data to adjust their strategies and benefit from these insights, because ultimately we're all here to try and achieve the same thing. So it's about working together, sharing the knowledge, sharing this information, and trying to achieve that common goal.
Mm-hmm. I think, yeah, I love the phrase buy-in and shared goal. I think that's absolutely probably something that you've been able to gain a lot of traction and success with. If you can create that partnership approach by proving application and capabilities, you know, this creates a really powerful team and gets you that momentum that you need to keep going. So yeah, great example there. Thank you. We're going to move into our final section now, and we're going to be kind of making this more event focused. So whilst we've talked about longer or mid to longer term initiatives, spend and footfall data, if there's large scale events, then, you know, clearly there's an opportunity to be assessing the impact and the benefits that they bring. I think what we'll do is we'll jump over to Joel, because I think he's got a great kind of case study here of a Taylor Swift concert and the impact of, I don't want to steal your branding, but the Swift lift in boosting local spending. So Joel, could you kind of run us through this case study and share with our listeners those insights?
It's a fun example of the application of some of this data. Obviously, there was a lot of speculation and consternation about how much financial impact a Taylor Swift concert might actually have on a given town or council. And there was some debate as to whether it was really that big of a deal. We did do all of the data crunching and analysis around all of the venues that Taylor Swift delivered worldwide. And the data and the trends were unequivocal that she is moving economies. Some of the interesting highlights to note: on average, the spend over the course of the 2 days before and the 2 days after any given Taylor Swift concert at restaurants, on average, went up 68%. The highest was 172%. In one particular market. Hotels saw a jump of between 42% if they were within 3 miles of the venue, and a little bit less if they were further out at 32%. But some real impact there. What we also looked at, though, was some of the indirect economic impact, not just what's going on the obvious industry sectors that we could easily measure and identify the positive lift. But what was the actual economic impact relative to the various jobs that were created to host that venue? Or the impact and opportunity that was driven through the local shops that were able to, sell tour memorabilia. So there was a lot of data points. And then what we had to do, of course, was to take away what is the story? What is the point other than she has an incredibly huge impact on any given economy when she comes to town? And there were a couple interesting ones. One was making sure that we all understand the power and the overall purchasing power of experiences and the demand consumers have and the amount that they will invest in an experience over perhaps, large ticket durable goods. To the extent that in 2023, for the duration of the Taylor Swift concert, in all the markets she visited, the spend on large ticket durable goods actually notably dropped. And we think that was due partly to inflation, but also partly due to the, sort of the savings and upcoming opportunity to spend on that experience. So a lot of really interesting learnings came out of the study. It did come across initially as sort of a fun, interesting tidbit, but there's some real lessons and learnings to uncover that that can drive additional planning and additional thought around building experiences and creating those economic impacts around different experiences.
I thought that was it's a great example. I mean, some of those numbers are eye-watering on the Taylor Swift use case, and I think again that just amplifies the power of this data. Looking at it outside of the core initiative, event, strategy, there's this wider kind of thread, this longer thread that runs through it, and this data is that common theme that brings everything together. So some great input there. Thank you. Just conscious of time, I think what we could do is bring Conrad in for just one last question on that point. We talked about benchmarking earlier. I don't know if there's anything else you'd like to build on the benchmarking case, or if we want to take that into kind of tracking consumer engagement before, during, and after implementing initiatives. Just wonder if there's a few more words from you around that point.
Certainly, definitely to build on Gerald's point, I think sometimes there is an obvious, there's some obvious effect, which is in your headline metric, and sometimes there isn't, right? I think that's also a fascinating area to explore. So often we get customers that come to us and say, well, I did this thing and I expected this, so can I have some data to demonstrate that? And sometimes that's the effect that has been felt is not in that metric, right? But there's nearly always another metric which has been affected and has. So for instance, maybe it didn't get the bump in volume of people, but maybe the people that did come spent a lot longer there than we expected, and maybe therefore spent more. So the combination, again, come back to this combining these data sets in order to find that insight. Or again, coming back to this kind of long-term trend question, I didn't have the effect on that particular weekend or day or festival week that we expected. But you know what? I can see that it was actually the beginning of a change. It was the beginning of a change in opening us up to a new audience or a new type of behavior. So I think that benchmarking, as we touched on, can be about how do I compare to my peers, but it's also how does this compare to the past and what's changed. So coming back to this point about, I think you often need to be thinking about the data and how you explore what the data tells you over a much longer time period than you might initially think. Okay.
Get us in there. Right. Okay. So I think we've kind of concluded the main discussion. So I'll just quickly thank all the speakers that contributed to that so far. However, I think it would be great to jump into a bit of a Q&A for the time that we have left. I think we've got a couple in the chat, so I'll jump in. I think there's one where I think the first one will probably get a view from each of you individually, but then we'll go into some more targeted questions after that. But a great one that we've kind of unlocked is how, and this is to everybody, how can footfall and spend inform rural areas that rely on tourism that maybe are seasonal, so they're kind of closing down outside of those summer months? Is there any way that footfall, spend data, benchmarks, catchment trends, flows, we've covered all of that today. Is there any of that could give them some confidence about staying open in winter months or extending that summer holiday period?
Sure.
Yeah, happy to take this one as a kickoff, and I'm sure Joel's got a load to add too. But I think I come back to 2 points there. One is the benchmarking. So maybe you're closing down at the moment, but maybe there's an area that you've observed that doesn't close down, right? That has a similar profile to you. And maybe they've put some kind of facility in there, or they have some kind of attraction which is more all year round, right? And is that successful or not? You can look to that. You can use the data to look at that let's call them a competitor, not necessarily a competitor, but that other area, and try and understand, okay, is that having a positive or a negative impact? And so look to that data to give you clues as to whether, if you were to do something similar, is that going to be worthwhile? I think the second point on that is, particularly in the tourism, with the tourism lens, is the mobility data offers you this ability, as we said earlier, to see what the origin of those visitors are, right? So if you were, for instance, I don't know, there was a large US contingent who visit a set of tourism sites in your area, and so you're reliant on this kind of US traffic, and your thought is, well, does that die down in the winter? Well, you don't know because you closed. So, but what you can use the data for is to say, okay, well, in the surrounding regions, are they still seeing a meaningful proportion of that type of visitor that drives your traffic, and therefore gives you clues as to whether, if you were to stay open, what your expectations, projections for what those visit rates might look like. So absolutely, you can use this to understand those kind of questions, certainly from a mobility data point of view.
Yeah, I think there's certainly that benchmarking. That's a good one, the benchmarking as to what else is working in other councils in other rural areas that's addressing seasonality. You could take another view to that same approach, or a slightly different twist to that, which is to say, okay, for those consumers locally or more transient, who are not staying throughout the additional seasons, what are some of the other activities that they are doing in the winter months that we can track through their spend and footfall behavior, that say, hey, look, we're doing some great stuff with mountain biking in this particular rural area within the council, but son of a gun, we do see the spend trend with those same people that suggest that they enjoy cross-country skiing as well, or sledding, or whatever it may be. And remember, we see each individual credit card holder, and we track each and every one of their purchases and obviously their footfall activity. And so we know that those same people have the higher propensity to come back if some of the activities they enjoy are introduced in that particular community. So you can watch what else they do in addition to what else might be going on in neighboring councils.
Yeah, just to follow on, I think both Conrad and Joel have covered most of the points there. But from a local authority perspective, rural areas are absolutely key, but and they're also very sensitive to uncertainty and to change. So it's important that we really understand the impact of various different things that are affecting those rural areas. And I think the beauty of this data, the footfall, the spend data, is it's easily transferable. So I think it's fair to say that generally you don't have as much data in the smaller rural areas as a local authority that we do in some of the bigger towns and cities, where we've got lots of sensors, etc., etc. And so we're more reliant on other sorts of data, like what we've discussed here, to really understand and unpick exactly what the impact of those events are. So this data can really go into a granular level in a rural capacity, and really help us understand those same trends that we can look at on those big events that we talked about, sort of Taylor Swift, etc., etc. So it is very transferable. So we can unpick those trends in rural areas as well.
That's a great. Oh,
you can also very quickly provide some segmentation insights and draw people based on those further segmentations as well. You know, I was just thinking, my wife and I often visit the Cotswolds, and our favorite spot is Burton on the Wold. But why aren't some of the other areas within the Cotswolds marketing to us to come in and stay with them? Right? We consistently go back to the same place. That's known data that's available to councils and would help drive marketing and tourism initiatives that could introduce us to some of the other beautiful spots throughout the Cotswolds.
I think you have absolutely touched on the point I was going to make. Defining an audience. You know, this data can bring your audience to the table, into your team. So thinking strategies, you know, you may have a very successful approach to summer. If you think about solutions and strategies for those other months, you know who you can pitch that into, and start to kind of invest in your marketing spend in different locations. And that could be domestic or international, but absolutely knowing who has the willingness and the propensity to visit those areas, those rural areas, is a great start, right? It kind of de-risks everything. Great. I'm going to move into Gary, if you don't mind. I've got a question for you here. What are your kind of thinking more macro? I think we touched on a little bit earlier, but I do think it'd be great if you could break this down a little bit more. But what are your biggest learnings to kind of securing and unpicking and leveraging this data to bring out its fullest value? And then thinking perhaps with that, overlaying a lens as to any future local authority challenges that I suppose might be out there at the moment that you can think of. If you use that as a reference point, how could someone perhaps start to unpick an opportunity for this data to help them solve some of those challenges?
I suppose that's the challenge in itself, is sort of trying to, you can never predict the future and what event's going to happen. We could have never understood what or imagined that we would have had a pandemic over sort of a few years ago, and what data we would have required at that point. It's almost answering the question in reverse. Is it's very difficult to position yourself to get the ideal bit of data. But I think it's been touched on before as well. I think I think it might have been Conrad, so apologies if it was Joel. It's about getting prepared as early as possible. I think that's absolutely key, and having a plan and a strategy just to try and, as best as possible, try and understand what bits of information do you need in order to measure success. So that's for me, that's the absolute key, and that's where I've been a big advocate around monitoring and evaluation. It's really about planning and understanding and measuring what success looks like, and almost having that agreed approach. But also along that point, in terms of biggest learnings, and I think we've spent a lot of this session agreeing with one another, so so that's great, I suppose. But also that no, and I think it may have been Conrad talking about this, but no single data set is perfect. Every single bit of data has its limitations. So knowing that is the case, and sort of working with that, I think is absolutely key. So in terms of the footfall, in terms of using it in the right context alongside other data sets, to get a comprehensive view. So you'd want to complement it, like with dwell time and spend data as well, because it just gives you a much more rounded story in terms of understanding the overall impact. Yeah, so I think that's pretty much it in terms of learning. Although again, I think it was touched on as well. Also, I think it's very important to look at data in equal periods. And so for the sort of the use case that I referred to earlier, I've sort of found the sweet spot being generally 3 months of data. So you collect 3 months of data, and if you're doing a before and after, you look at that 3 months before, and then you compare it to the 3 months after, ideally. And again, you want to sort of measure it by removing biases and external influences like seasonality. So you'd ideally want to measure that against the same period in the future. So just so that you can really unpick it. But yeah, I suppose in terms of the future, it is really difficult. So I don't actually know what we're going to need data for in what way in the future, because we'll almost encounter that as and when it arrives.
But I think maybe you could add into that, you know, through networks, through your colleagues, obviously, you know, yourself and your experience, you'd be probably happy to help people unpick anything or where they see an opportunity. Certainly here at Huq, we've got a great team and, you know, lots of collateral that explore potential use cases and how it would help. So you wouldn't necessarily be operating in a very unknown space. I think it's a lot of the advice here is about have that conversation, isn't it? And unpick what the opportunity is.
Yeah, I think it's also about having a strategy. So I like to sort of, again, going back to sort of the monitoring and evaluation approach, really understanding initially from the onset as early as possible, what are the challenges? What is the key exam question that you're trying to answer here? And then you can move forward in terms of looking at sort of key aim. What is the ultimate vision? What is success? And then split it down into aims, objectives, and then measurements of success, KPIs, key performance indicators, and that then leads you into what data you need in actual to answer that question. So I think having a structured strategy from the onset is probably the best kind of advice that I would give, and that can be translated into anything at all in any world or any situation or scenario.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's great follow on there. I just probably got 1 or 2 more questions. So I think I'll bring Joel in, but I think there's a similar question for Conrad to build on as well. Where do we envisage spend data and insights and analytics kind of evolving to? You know, what's the next iteration? Because, you know, we've already talked about the power that it could bring, but where else could it go? And I think there's a copy paste on the footfall element to kind of between you develop out. So Joel, if you want to lead us into the future of transaction data, that would be great.
This is a really simple one. We have only scratched the surface. With the introduction of AI and machine learning, it's going to absolutely explode. And so where does it go from here? We leverage AI and machine learning to do 2 things really, really well. Number 1, instead of understanding what did happen, how do we predict what's going to happen? And to do that with a level of accuracy that is never been comprehended before. And the second is, if you can predict what is going to happen, then you should also be able to have extremely tailored and specific recommendations on what to do around that particular prediction. And so that is going to completely change the game. I'm sure there's many other things we could point to in terms of aggregation of data and, you know, the ability to exchange data more freely. But from where I sit, the power of AI and what that means for prediction, prescription, and really intelligent recommendations that are driven through those technologies, I don't think anything comes close.
Yeah, I'll pick up on that as well. Totally agree. I mean, the idea of looking into the future, the power of this data to look forward, that's ultimately what all of our customers want to know, right? They can't change what's happened. They want to know what they should do next. And so that's a big focus of ours, certainly in terms of what mobility data can offer as a lens looking forward. I think there's also, picking up on Joel's point in terms of what AI brings to the world of data analytics. We've touched on it a little bit today, but you know, our customers shouldn't have to be experts in the minutiae of how mobility data works or transaction data works. What they really want to get to is so what? So what should I do with my space? So what does that mean for me? And I think we're in a really, really exciting period of, you know, data companies beginning to apply those AI layers to help join the dots. We talk about the fact that no data set sits alone. What these AI layers are offering us the ability to do is to see the unseen connections, see the unseen implications of the relationship between one data set and another, and the kind of cause and effect. And I'm really optimistic that we're kind of rapidly moving to a phase where we're going to make life easier. Us as data providers should be making life easier to local authorities, to bids, to all of our customers, that we can do all of the heavy lifting and they can focus on, making it happen.
That's great. Thank you so much, Conrad. And thank you to all the speakers. I think we're going to call time here on the Q&A. I think we can clearly see that, Huq and Mastercard, we're partnering, we've got a lot of experience, and we're partnering with local governments and bids across the UK. And it's great to see the power of this data, this spend data, this footfall data, the power of it and the difference that it's making in the everyday world. It feels like with the attendees that we have today, we're all seemingly on the same mission of trying to make things better, and data is absolutely a key part of that. Before we sign off, just remember that this session has been recorded, and we will share that with you all shortly. Do get in touch if there's any further questions. We'd love to talk to you. And I'm sure Gary wouldn't mind the odd question as well. Sure, that's okay, Gary. But yeah, thank you so much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed this webinar, and do look out for further updates from Huq. Appreciate it. Goodbye.